allegedly recording. All right, so chapter 17, this time period, is called Reconstruction. And your book dates at 1863 to 1877. A more accurate time frame would be 1865 to 1876, if you ask me. Is when historians generally will label it. But this is how to put the country back together after the Civil War. So we're going to rebuild the South and the North back together into one whole country. Think of it like something that's been a piece of cloth that's been torn apart. How are you going to get it back together? Can you ever get that piece of cloth back together? You guys ever have like a favorite blanket when you were a kid? How many of you still have a blankie? Okay. And once it's ripped and the edges fray, what do your parents usually do to it? It just disappeared one day. Parents told you it went to live on a nice farm or something. It didn't. It got thrown away. We can't do that as a country. So how do we put North and South back together again? If we can. Have we? Is one of the big questions. So that's what we're going to look at with this chapter. As we're going through this chapter, one of those essay questions that might come up on your test would be this one right here. And it might look a little different than the one you have there. So evaluate the effectiveness of Reconstruction. You guys have that one? You know it's good. In these three areas, politically, socially, and economically, does Reconstruction work? Does it grant equality to African Americans, like it seemed we were heading for after the Civil War? Does it work in some areas and not some others? So we're going to break it down into those three categories as we go through. But what I always really like to start with is what it means for us today. And on page 510, there's a Confederate flag. When I talk about the Civil War, when I talk about Reconstruction, I always start here. So when you see this flag, somebody's got it up in their yard, somebody's got it up in a window, in the back of a truck, what do you think? What do you think it represents to them? What does it represent to other people? So it represents the South, anything Missouri and below, and around the Mississippi and east. It's sort of, you wouldn't think of like Arizona though with this. So it's deep South. It's Texas and that over. So it's the South. What else is this used for? I'm rebellious, yeah. So I'm opposed to authority, therefore I will wave this flag. The first time I ever taught for Southeast Technical College, I was an adjunct instructor. It's going to be the first history class ever. I'm going to do this lesson. I pulled into the campus at Winona, and I parked right next to a truck that had this in the back of the window. Why does some kid from Rushford or Preston have a Southern Rebel flag up in the back of his window? What's it represent to him? Or, here's an example for the Red Wing group. When driving into town on Highway 58, I would go through Hay Creek, and for years, it's down now, I looked on the way in, someone in Hay Creek had a rebel flag up on a flagpole in front of their house. Why does someone in Hay Creek fly this flag?
They're racist.
Possibly racist. Maybe they're saying whites are better than blacks. They don't believe in equality. So it could be a racial thing.
I know my dad has it, but back then it was fought in the South because then it was more of a, it's still patriotic than in the
So people say it's my history. Whether you agree with the cause or not, it's my history. My great-great-granddad fought, and so we keep it as a memento to his hard work and his sacrifice during that war. The only other reason that people will say that they use this flag in modern day is that it means country. It means, rural, not from the city. And so, country boys can wave this flag and sort of mean it to mean that they're kind of rednecks or hillbillies, if you will, and they're proud of it, and they have parties with kegs and trucks and stuff. That sort of idea behind it. And so this flag still brings up lots of images for us today. I read a book a few years ago about a guy who grew up in the Deep South in the middle of segregation. They're trying to integrate the University of Mississippi, and the Stars and Bars was flying to the University of Mississippi game, and they're all singing, Dixie and stuff. And he said he felt like he was at a Nazi rally, and that was sort of the feeling he got as he was there. So some people will look at this flag with disgust. Others will look at it with pride as history. Some people will still identify it with traits that they believe are powerful today, urban versus rural. But in 1865, that flag was a flag of rebellion and treason against the United States of America. And the Civil War touched nearly everyone in the United States at the time. So if you look at overall casualties from this war, this is by far the most devastating war in American history. Because everyone who dies is an American, or at least an American who doesn't want to be an American, but is counted as an American. So you're looking at 620,000 Civil War casualties over this roughly 4-year time frame. And to put it in perspective, you look at who was eligible to serve and if they served. And in the North, 50% of every eligible male served in the Union Army at some point during the Civil War. So 1 out of every 2 males that you saw walking down the street had served in the Union Army during the war. In the South, 90% of eligible men in the South served in the Confederate Army. So if there were 10 men from the South, 1865 here, 9 of them had served. Only 1 of them did not. So everyone had a brother, a dad, an uncle, a relative, a son involved in this war, possibly hurt in this war, or died in this war. So this is an emotional issue that runs deep in the United States at the time. It was bloody. It was vicious. The tactics for killing others was brutally effective, and it was photographed. It's one of the first well-documented and photographed wars. And so hundreds of thousands of pictures were taken, a lot of them on glass plates, and were preserved throughout history. Some of the glass plates were just thrown away or lost, recycled, used in windows or greenhouses. But a lot of them were preserved. So a lot of historians are very interested in the Civil War, and one of the reasons is it's kind of one of the best documented wars of our time. When we get to the last big war before this, the Mexican-American War, we're still using artist drawings and things. Now we have the actual pictures of what happened and the people. And that sort of changes people's connection to that war. But if you look at the United States and the South after the Civil War, the South is in ruin. And it has basically been laid waste to by the Union Army. So Richmond, Atlanta, Tennessee, Virginia, all of them had towns burnt down, crops destroyed, and massive devastation put on not just the military armies, but also the civilian armies in the field. So before the war, 25% of the nation's wealth was held in the South. After the war, it was 12%. This shows you the declining status of the South in the entire United States through the 1800s. If I ask you, where's most of the wealth in this country in 1800, percentage-wise, what's the answer? It's in the South. Some as high as 50%, 70% of the nation's wealth in 1800 is in the South. 70 years later, most of it is in the North. Most of it has either been destroyed or industrialization has moved the economy away from the South. So the South is economically in ruin. They've been conquered. You have Union troops occupying the South, all the major cities, New Orleans, Richmond. They're all held by and ruled by military generals. So you don't have a governor and the state legislature that are functioning in any of the southern states after the war. The military governor says what's going to happen, and he institutes whatever the president asks him to do. You guys know any Southerners? How would they take to being in conquered status? Not real nice, would they? They've got a definite pride, and so to be conquered and to be made to feel subjugated is probably difficult for a Southern boy. Not to mention the fact that people that they had formerly considered property are now free and are celebrating and enjoying their freedom. And so African Americans are now allowed to not be property, to not be chattel, and what's going to happen to them in this society? So Sherman, when he's marching through Georgia, will issue order. Sorry about the misprint. Field Order 15. He basically had so many freed slaves following him that he said, you know what? I can't have all these freed slaves following me. I can't feed them. They're slowing down my army. Here, take this land over here. Take these islands and go farm it. Have at it. And so the rumor begins to spread that the U.S. federal government is going to take the land and is going to give it away to free slaves. You're going to get your 40 acres and a mule. And those old southern white plantation owners, they're going to get their land taken away and they're going to lose their status and their property. So many in the South, especially in the rich white plantation community, are highly fearful of what the future is going to hold for them. The Freedmen's Bureau is also freedom. The Freedmen's Bureau's job is to educate, clothe, and train freed slaves. Because in the South, there are no schools. There are no public schools in the South in 1865. There are public schools in the North, but not in the Deep South. And if you were a white plantation sort of child in the South, your parents paid for private school. Everybody else, sorry. So the Freedmen's Bureau's job is to come in and provide schooling and to start educating these newly freed slaves. 90% of them can't read or write. Now they're going to have to function on their own. How are they going to sign a contract? How are they going to go into a store and do math? All of these things the Freedmen's Bureau is charged with. So this costs a lot of money. What kind of people are generally teachers in the Freedmen's Bureau? Would Southern whites want to teach former slaves how to read and write and live good lives? No. So you get a lot of Northerners coming down, volunteering, with missionary, moralistic intentions, coming down to volunteer in the Freedmen's Bureau, adding another group of people to that Deep South that those former rulers, the plantation owners, and the elite whites are going to be opposed to. So here's the fun stuff. You had a Confederate great-grandpa? Great-great-grandpa.
Who's great?
This is my third great-grandpa, Henry Washington Stockard. He's a private with the 30th Iowa Regiment, Company B. Served in the war from 1862 to 1865. Was in over 30 separate engagements, and most famously, he was at the Battle of Atlanta and Sherman's March to the Sea. So he literally helped destroy Georgia. And I'm sure if I taught this class in Georgia, I would be persona non grata because of this history. Sherman's March to the Sea is still hated in Georgian history and Georgian lore. So, but it's a point of pride for me. I wanted to name my second son after him, but my wife wouldn't let me. I wanted him to be Henry Washington, but instead he became Elliot. But I still call him Henry sometimes, just to mess with my wife. So back to our question, we're looking at the political changes for freed slaves. It basically breaks into three categories of what happens during this time period of Reconstruction. I'm going to throw a lot of R words at you. So this overall time period is called Reconstruction. But you can break it down into three phases. The first phase is Andrew Jackson's phase that he calls Restoration. And so Andrew Johnson, who will become president after Lincoln is shot, which is another calamity that we kind of have to skip over here as we start this class, but Lincoln's killed by John Wilkes Booth. So now who's going to be president? And we'll get to Andrew Johnson becoming president. But so this is a a national mourning period as well as just finishing a massive war in which everybody's had somebody involved, hurt, dying in half of the country, property and devastation. This is why I use PowerPoint. You see my handwriting here. Restoration. So Andrew Johnson wants to just quickly put North and South back together as painlessly and as quickly as possible, and that'll be his plan in 1865. When we get to the radical Republicans from 1866 to 1870, they really want to, the only way to phrase it is radical. So this is the radical Republican phase. And then finally, we get to the end, as we get towards 1876, we get into the redemption phase. A lot of R words. And so, things for freed slaves under Andrew Johnson's plan, restoration, will be bad. Well, they will get worse. Almost nearly as bad as slavery. Under the control of the radical Republicans, things will get much better. For a small 4 or 5 year time window, freed slaves will have political power, they'll be able to vote, they'll hold office, and have control of many of the state legislatures in the South. But then, as the Republican tide loosens over the whole country, Northerners sort of get tired of dealing with the South. The economic crisis of 1873 sets in. The Democrats in the South will gain control of the South again with the help of the KKK, and they'll redeem the South from this northern travesty called Reconstruction. So those are the phases we're going to talk about as we go through this. Yeah, this one's not in there. It's an addition. So what happens is, as we start this rebuilding process after the war, we get Andrew Johnson's, the former vice president and now president, versus the ideas of the Republicans from the North. Why would Abraham Lincoln, senator from Illinois, former congressman from Illinois, not senator, former congressman from Illinois, opposed to slavery, the spread of slavery, have Andrew Johnson be his vice president in the 1864 election? This former Southerner from Tennessee, former slave owner. Why would he have this man be his vice president? Why do presidents have sometimes polar opposites as their vice presidents on the ticket? What are they trying to do? Trying to, yes, appeal to a different type of voter who might not like them. So if you have somebody who's really conservative, you might put someone who's a little bit more moderate or liberal on there and hope to sort of get some of those extra votes and get that middle. And that's what Andrew Johnson was. He was an appeal to many of the voters in the border states and many of the sort of northern Democrats who maybe weren't totally for the end of slavery and wanted to see that balance on that ticket. So he's the only former Southern senator to stay loyal to the Union during the Civil War. And he comes in with a lot of Southern mindsets. If you look in your reading Belmonte 12.6, you can read his ideas on black equality, and very Southern in his point of view. Benjamin Wade, leader of Congress, coming out of the North, he says we have to punish the South. We have to show the South that what they did was wrong and not allow these people to just come in and shape the country politically or philosophically again. So you have these two visions. I used to have like a punching bag that would come out and you'd hear ding ding, but I lost all my sound effects, so sorry. You have to imagine them. They're fighting, okay? Okay, it's gone. So at first, he said, we're going to be hard on these Southerners. We're going to take care of these traitors. But back then, Congress only went into session early in the year and then didn't necessarily come back into session. So when he becomes president, after Lincoln's assassination. Congress will not be in session until December. So when's Lincoln's assassination? It's in April. Isn't it? Yeah, it's April, I think. So he has 6 months in which he has no Congress. And he can basically, through military executive order in these southern areas, or through plans of his own, using the pardon, to shape Reconstruction. So this short time period of about 8 months is called Restoration. And he very quickly starts to pardon off old southern plantation owners. Why was getting a pardon so important? If you were a traitor and you had helped aid an enemy cause, and you get a pardon, what does that allow you to do? How about this one? If you commit a crime, say we go to a bank right now, you and I, and you run in and rob it, and I drive the getaway car, and they catch me, what are they going to do to my car? They're going to seize it, right? Like if you carry drugs in a car, they'll seize your car. If you commit a crime, they'll seize it. And that's what had happened to southern landowners. They lost the rights to their property. They did not have the right to vote. They lost their rights of citizenship. Today, if you're a convicted felon, you have lost your right to vote. The only way you can get your right to vote back is to appeal to the governor, and then he can pardon that crime even after you've served the sentence, and you can have your voting rights back. So there's a big controversy right now in the South because Haley Barbour, the governor of Mississippi, just pardoned like 220 people. And you guys heard about that in the news? Anybody? Anyway. And he basically was giving them their voting rights back, and people were mad that he pardoned them. And so these wealthy landowners, they come, they pretend to be sorry, they get their pardon, they get their land back, and they get their political rights back. So Johnson does that in massive numbers. He has to hire new secretaries to handle all the pardons. He doesn't even look at half of them. He also will appoint new governors, and we get to December, Congress is about to come into session. He says, we've restored the South. It's all done. We've figured this out. But what's the problem? If you were a Northerner and you lost 2 sons in that war, and all of a sudden the new Congress is coming back, and guess who's in it? All the same Confederate leaders who tried to leave the country and start the war are coming back to Congress now because they've been reelected. Would you be mad? Awkward silence. We'd all be mad. And this will start for the next really 10 years and even longer, the political term called waving the bloody shirt. And so northern politicians will say, I'm not going to let these southerners come back and take control again and walk on the memory of all our dead boys. And so they would bring up the image of the South and the war they fought and all those dead Union soldiers and say, nope, we're not going to let the South rule over Congress or the federal government again. So Johnson's goal was, like all politicians, to get reelected. And he badly misunderstands how the people in the North feel. He thought this would be a quick process. It was over. He would have this coalition of Southern Democrats, moderates in the North, and then that would get him reelected come election time. And it doesn't work. Any questions so far? Any complaints so far? Demands for refunds? None? Okay. So here you can see the radical Republicans say, no, we need to totally remake the South. We need to, in many ways, make it much like the North. We need to have free labor so that the market reigns, if you will. The other thing we need to have is more manufacturing, capital-based economies, not agriculturally based economies. Thaddeus Stevens, one of the most radical of all the Northern Republicans, says we need to confiscate If you were a Confederate landholder, you lose your land. We're going to give it away. But what really angered many in the North were what were called the Black Codes. The Black Codes were a list of rules that all the states came up with that took away the rights of the newly freed slaves. Congratulations, you're not a slave anymore. But you know what? What if you quit work and you just take off? Well, you could be arrested as a vagrant, and then the sheriff could then take you to a place and make you work there. Does that sound like slavery to you? Sounds like slavery to me. What if you were a freed slave and you wanted to become a shoe cobbler or a carpenter? No, you got to get a license. And that license costs X amount of money. Can most of these freed slaves pay for that? Nope. So what are they going to have to do? They have to go back to work in an agricultural system. Say you have a 10-year-old child, you want him to go to school. Can he go to school? No, the law says he has to go to work. If you're an African American, you must be at work in the field. So if you look at the laws in your book, in the Belmonte book, speaking of America, I think they're in there, 12.3 of the Louisiana Black Code. You can see that it is basically going to make the same social, political, economic system as slavery. And Northerners say that's enough. So in December 1865, they exclude the Southern representatives from Congress. Only Congress can certify the people that are sent to it. I don't know if you guys knew this. So Congress determines who becomes a member. So say we vote and elect a senator. Maybe he barely wins, like only by 300 votes. And we send him there. Congress can decide, you know, it's too close, we're going to wait for the recall, so we're not going to allow you to be a member until it's all done, when we say it can. Can that happen? It did happen. It happened to Senator Al Franken from Minnesota. His election win was so narrow that the Senate at first said, no, you can't be a member until you get it settled out. And so the Republicans in the North say none of these ex-Confederates, the former Confederate vice president is going to be a senator. Former Confederate cabinet members were going to be senators. None of you are allowed to go home. So you end up with a Northern Republican Congress, and they're going to pass the Civil Rights Act, and they're going to expand the Freedmen's Bureau to help freed slaves, not only with schools, but also with court cases, so that they know how to set up a contract with their former plantation owners so they don't get taken advantage of. Johnson will try to veto these things, but the Congress will always override it. How many votes does it take to override a veto? Remember your government class. You need a 2/3 majority. So the Republicans consistently get those 2/3 majorities and override those vetoes. So they passed this civil rights bill saying that all people are to be treated equal under the law. Said, you know what, this might go to the Supreme Court. This might be found unconstitutional. How do you stop the Supreme Court from finding a law to be unconstitutional? You have to directly add it to the Constitution. So you have to add a constitutional amendment. So the 13th Amendment is passed saying there can be no slavery, but the 14th Amendment will be passed. So you see, any person born in the United States is a citizen. Every citizen must be given due process under the law, and all are entitled to equal protection of the laws. This has become one of the most important amendments to the Constitution that we have. And it's one that's still being argued today. So recent court cases in Wisconsin about the union fight between Walker and the public unions, they're hinging on interpretations of the 14th Amendment. Unions are going to sue based on the 14th Amendment. So in order for these southern states to get back in, they have to pass the 13th Amendment. Now they also have to pass the 14th Amendment. And this gets wide support in the North. The radical Republicans win the elections of 1866 and gain even more power, and so Johnson is in trouble. So the Reconstruction Act of 1867 is passed, It gives blacks the right to vote in the South, divides it into military districts. All these old states think, hey, we're back. No, you're not. You're under the control of the military general. Universal male suffrage for those in the South. And then you can come back in. And they will also pass the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act is basically that if the Senate approved someone to be a cabinet member, and if Johnson wants to fire them, then he must also get Senate approval. It's a way to check the power of the president. And so he's going to provoke them, hoping to set up a court battle. So he's going to fire one of his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and he's going to name Ulysses Grant to the Secretary of War. Grant's not a fool. He doesn't like Andrew Johnson. He says, no, thank you. I don't want it. And he won't take the office. But the Congress is going to impeach Andrew Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act. And they have the votes to impeach him. So they can remove Andrew Johnson from office. Basically, it's a backroom deal that gets cut. And they go to him and say, you need to stop being an obstructionist to these plans. You need to basically stand down, and we won't remove you. Because if they remove him for this, what precedent does that show for impeachment? Can you remove a president if you don't like him politically? If they remove him this way? Yes. Politically, we disagreed with you, so we impeached you and removed you. But they fall one vote short so that they don't set that precedent. So now, if we're going to impeach a president and remove him, what are the reasons we're going to do it? He's done something criminal. He or she has done something criminal and has broken the law. And that's why Nixon was on his way to being impeached before he resigned. So we get to 1868. It's obvious that Johnson can't win. Ulysses Grant will run as a Republican nominee. Is he popular? Yeah, he basically turned the war around in the East. Lincoln brought him in because all his generals couldn't win. Finally, finds Grant fighting out west, victory after victory, brings him in, and he wins the war. So you got this general of renown running. You see what he says about it. He was forced into the nomination in spite of himself. He probably wasn't up for the job, probably intellectually or even energetically speaking. And so he surrounds himself with people who are going to help him. What happens when a president sort of kind of laid back and delegates authority to other people and lets them sort of run things? What bad things can happen when you don't always know what's going on? Well, corruption is going to start to be a problem. And during the Grant administration, corruption will increase. A lot of his cabinet members will be corrupt, taking bribes and kickbacks to especially railroad companies. So that's going to bode ill for the Republicans in the future. But it's this new base of African American voters that really give him the win. So you see, he wins with less than 53% of the vote. He beat Horatio Seymour by 300,000 votes, and he had over 500,000 African American votes in his favor. So the popular vote went to him because of all these newly freed slaves who could vote in this election. But by the time we get to the next few elections, the number of African American voters is going to go down dramatically. So we get to 1870, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia now have to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments to be brought back in. So we get the 14th Amendment equal protection under the law. And then we get to the 15th Amendment, the right of all citizens of the United States shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. You can't stop someone from voting because of their race or color. So the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments really will lay the future for the civil rights movement as we get into the 1950s and 60s. They'll become the legal basis for that movement later on. And so finally, Texas and Virginia and Mississippi come back in 1870. And now all the states have been readmitted to the Union. So former slaves can now vote during this time period of radical Republican Reconstruction. And 5 states have black electoral majorities in the Deep South. They will form what's called the Union League. The Union League is sort of the advocacy group for freed slaves and African Americans in the South, and it educates them on the different candidates, organizes them to register to vote, and leads those kinds of petition drives. And you have this middle class in the South emerge in the black community of teachers and ministers. And that will last all the way up into the civil rights movement. And it's this group of teachers and ministers and educators that will become the leaders of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. So one of the successes of Reconstruction is this establishment of, even if it's a small middle class community of African Americans, who eventually someday will be the Martin Luther Kings and the Ralph Abernathy's and the Andy Youngs of the future. So, hey, let's play some trivia. Hiram Rhodes, Rebels, first black member of Congress elected to the Senate from Mississippi in 1870. So there's your first African American senator to the United States. Since him, how many black senators have there been? Throw some guesses out. Oh my gosh, good job. Is that in your PowerPoint?
No.
Oh gosh, good job. Only 5. So in 130 years since then, we've had 5 more. One you should know offhand. Barack Obama, Senator from Illinois. Carol Moseley Braun from Illinois. What was his name? He was picked to fill Barack Obama's spot. I think his name was Roland Harris. He was African American, and then 2 more from Mississippi from this time period. But otherwise, that's it. So a lot of people today will be like, "Oh, we've come so far. Anybody can get elected." And statistically, the odds are still very much against an African American man or woman being elected to the Senate of the United States. You can see it in that statistic. So, in the South, you have the 2-party system, Republicans and Democrats. Republicans were viewed as sort of traitors, as Northerners. So, to be a Republican in the South was, in many ways, to be seen as not loyal to the South. So Southern Republicans were moderates. They were dependent upon the federal government making sure that African American voters could vote freely. And without them, they would lose power. They were often called scalawags by Democratic Southerners. Scalawag being a derisive term for somebody who's not loyal. Many white Northerners, when they came down as teachers for the Freedmen's Bureau or businessmen, they would come down looking maybe to get ahead economically or on some business project. They were called carpetbaggers. These carpetbaggers would have their stuff packed up in a cheap suitcase, and they would be treated like an outsider there as well. How many of you have been to the South with your Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa accent? People look at you and go, "What? Where are you from?" And how many of you have gone to the South and tried to talk to a waitress and gone, I don't know what you're saying? Because they talk with such a different accent, and you ask for a pop. How many of you use the word pop? Don't ask for pop down south. Don't do it. There you go. Or what kind of Coke do you want? Yeah, if you have orange Coke, I would like a Pepsi Coke, please. What? No, that's only in the South. Yep. And many whites in the South dislike the Republican agenda so much, saw it as anti-South, that they'll begin to organize paramilitary groups to resist what they consider to be the northernism of the Republicans. So they'll attack Republican leaders, judges, African Americans who get too loud or get too economically well off. Oftentimes, you'll see them attack black sharecroppers right at harvest time and they'll chase them off so that they lose their crop, or and that there would be delay in them getting their crop in. And it becomes so bad that you're going to have the KKK Act of 1871 passed. And they're going to arrest thousands, but it still lives on and even up through today. It was started by Nathan Bedford Forrest, former cavalryman of the Confederacy. Sort of started as almost like a former soldiers club, like a VFW or something. And from there, it becomes more violent. It was said that when they first dressed up in the white sheets, it was designed to scare the freed slaves into thinking that the Confederate dead were coming back to haunt them. And then from there, it gets even more vicious and repressive. Wrong video, sorry. There we go, right video.
A shadowland of secret clubs and societies.
You guys see and hear that?
Take shape. In Mississippi, the White Liners. In Louisiana, the Knights of the White Camellia. And across the South, the Ku Klux Klan.
If you grow up in a society and where for centuries you have been taught that other people are your racial inferiors, it's very hard to accept the enormous social change involved in their emancipation. Any benefit that accrued to blackness was interpreted as a loss of whiteness. Education, the acquisition of property, was viewed as somehow unnatural.
Ku Klux Klan does not see itself as lawlessness, but as the law. Because they do not believe that black men deserve political power or know what to do with it once they have it, they think that it's their right, maybe even their Christian responsibility, to destroy black political power before it has a chance to become too entrenched.
Abram Colby had been elected to the Georgia legislature, along with Tunis Campbell. The Democrats wanted to curb his power in the county. They tried bribes, but Colby turned them away. In October of 1869, the Klan set out to teach him a lesson.
They were the mercenary forces of the Democrats who were trying to regain power. They were not simply using the ballot because they felt they would lose with the ballot box. They were using violent coercion. They were eliminating their competitors.
Colby's attackers could not hide behind their hoods.
Some of them were the first-class men in our town. One is a lawyer, one a doctor, some are farmers. I knew the voices of those men as well as I know my own.
They would take people out of their houses or their cabins in the dark of the night, strip them out in a road, make them run down the road, make them sometimes lie on a rock where they would be whipped, where men would line up to whip them. Sometimes they would burn parts of their bodies. These were sadistic tortures.
They said to me, "Do you think you will ever vote another damn radical ticket?" I said, if there was an election tomorrow, I would vote the radical ticket. They set in and whipped me 1,000 licks more.
This was a war of terror. The Ku Klux Klan, organized in 1867, is an original American terrorist organization.
So the KKK is actively removing Republican support in the South. Like the video said, they even see it as really their Christian duty. The natural order has been upset. We need to restore God's order back to the way society interacts. And so they'll often sing Christian hymns in their marches, and give money to local churches, and then the pastor will let them speak at that church and be a part of that worship service. What else? So the KKK Act was passed, but it still exists throughout the South through this time. Civil Rights Act of 1875 outlaws racial discrimination in public places, but if you're an African American and you've been discriminated against in a public place, you have to prove that in federal court. The onerous proof is on you. You don't get to accuse somebody and then have them be guilty. I mean, innocent until proven guilty. You have to prove that happened. So it becomes a very difficult legal hurdle to jump. And so, as Northern support wanes for Reconstruction in the South, as the KKK and the Democrats become more popular in the South, we'll move into this last period of time called redemption. And the conservative Democrats, the Redeemers, will end up taking control back of the South. And one of the ways they're going to do that is to stop African Americans from voting. And if you remember, we passed the 15th Amendment. You can't deny someone the right to vote based on color or a previous condition of servitude. So what's a way around that? What's a loophole you can create? Well, they will create loopholes called the poll tax. How many of you would vote if you had to pay $20 to do it? You guys wouldn't vote? No one in here would vote. $20. Come on, that's your voice. That's your privilege. $20. Come on, that's half a tank of gas. By this summer, it'd only be like a quarter of a tank of gas. Half a tank of gas to vote. No one in here would do it. Well, that's what will be instituted on voters in the South. You must pay this tax in order to vote. What kind of people can't afford this tax? Poor African Americans and freed slaves. So, okay, so what if you're a poor white? I can't afford the poll tax. Well, you can still vote. You know how? The grandfather clause. The grandfather clause says that if your grandfather had previously voted, then you're exempt from the poll tax. Whose grandfathers had previously voted, white or black? Whites. Now, your poor whites can still vote. Your rich whites can vote, but who can't vote? Your poor blacks. You effectively reduced the Republican-leaning freed black population in the South through these two tactics. If those didn't work, some states would also use something called literacy tests. And it's basically like, can you read before you come in to vote? And whoever administered the test could do it selectively. So, say Bubba Jenkins, local white guy, whose grandfather didn't vote, comes in and says, I got to pass a literacy test. It's like, okay, Bubba, read this. You know, Billy ran up the hill. Bob saw Sally run. Good job. And then say a local African American comes and says, I need to pass the literacy test. Like, take Section 4, Article 15 of the Mississippi Constitution. Please read that out loud and tell me what it means. Well, remember, 80 to 90% of freed slaves in the South can't read. So the literacy test essentially erases their vote and stops them from voting as well. So by the time we get to the 1850s, 1860s, less than 10% of African Americans in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia are registered to vote or are allowed to vote. So on top of the Democrats in the South, the KKK, the end of Republican sort of and Northern care for the South in Reconstruction, the Supreme Court will also weaken African American voting rights through this time period. In my other class, I start talking about the Supreme Court, and I say it's going to be worthless for about a solid 100 years. So if you start with the Dred Scott case in 1858, and you think maybe the Supreme Court finally does something positive in terms of civil rights in this country in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. So for about 100 years, the Supreme Court will consistently set back the rights of African Americans in this country. And one of the first blows is in 1876, U.S. versus Crookshank, and it says, the 14th Amendment protects civil rights from state governments, not other individuals. So equal protection under the law, right? I can go and I can have dinner at this restaurant. No, you don't get equal protection to go to a public place. That's just from the state government. Individuals can still restrict that right. I can say who comes into my business, right? It's my property. It's my private property. So if I don't want to serve blacks in my hotel or in my restaurant, this says that I don't have to. We get to 1896, we'll get Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically will allow for separate but equal facilities, even publicly. So you could have a public white school and a public black school. And that will be affirmed by the United States Supreme Court as well. So we've seen the three political areas of Reconstruction: Restoration, the Radical Republican time period, and then Redemption. So what about social changes? This is probably the greatest area of achievement for African Americans during Reconstruction, because some really good things do happen here that really do set the base and the foundation for the future civil rights movements. One of the coolest things for many freed slaves was just the ability to do what you want when you want. Moving about. In your Belmonte 12:1 reading, you saw it, where you can go fishing whenever you want. You can go find old family members like Lily Ann Gray was looking for her husband. 4 million of them, the first thing was just, I'm going to go. I always tell people, how many of you are 18 or older? How many of you have graduated high school or older? When you were getting ready to graduate high school, what did you say you were going to do? Once I graduate high school, I'm going to get in my car and do what? I'm out of here. I'm leaving this town in a trail of dust in my rearview mirror. I'm never coming back. I said that's what I was going to do. The problem was I drove a 1976 Ford Pinto. You don't get very far out of town in a Ford Pinto before it breaks down. You got to come back. So a lot of them, hey, let's go find some old family members. Let's go find people. Let's just go see what we can see. But can you live like that? What's eventually going to happen? You got to work, right? You got to live. So many of them end up back around their established areas where they have those relationships. Okay. When I was 18, it's like, I'm going to go live here So I moved to Phoenix, Arizona for 6 months. But then why did I move back to Iowa? Because my dad was there, my mom was there, all my friends were there. I didn't have a car. I'm not taking the bus with all the crazy people. In Phoenix, literally like crazy people on the bus in Phoenix. So I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to move back to all my friends. Freed slaves end up having to do the same thing. Some of them say, no way, I'm not living next to that old master. I remember that guy who used to beat me and whip me. I'm going to the city. So you see, the population of the cities double. The black population of the cities doubled by 1870. Some of them head north. Like, I'm not living in this culture in the South anymore. So just personal freedoms. It used to be when you were a slave, if a white man or woman were coming, you had to step aside, tip your hat off to them. Good day, sir. And show deference to them. You don't have to do that anymore. You can walk by them, maybe give them a bump with your shoulder. You know. And of course, Southern whites are horribly offended by this. Many freed slaves would love to celebrate Emancipation Proclamation Day, and they'd have a party and a parade and a picnic, and it would be described in the Southern newspapers as a spectacle, as a wild celebration because of their dislike for that. So, personal freedom to move, to not have to show deference to whites, control over your family. Before, during slavery, the white plantation owner told you where you were going to work. Your marriage wasn't accepted by law. So you're like, hey, I've been married to this woman for 20 years. Well, I'm mad at you when I'm selling her. And you could sell her and the kids off and away, and you had no control over it. Now, a freed black man has the right to marry a black woman, and no one can tell them, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. So they're going to more closely model the gender roles of the time. Okay? What has always been sort of the ideal in most of American history up until recently when it comes to men and women. Men are going to do what? Men and women are married. Who's going to work? The man's going to work and the woman's going to stay home, right? Or work if she needs to make extra money. And so they will start to do that just like the northern middle class ideal is at the time as well. So the men have more authority. They work. Women work at the discretion of their husbands and their family and their needs, not necessarily some white person telling them when to work. When sharecropping is first set up, the former plantation owners will say, all right, you're going to work in a big group again, and we're going to have a guy on a horse, sort of a supervisor. He's going to tell you what to do. Does that remind you a lot of slavery? You say, no, we're not going to let that happen. We're not doing it that way. I'm going to have this 10 acres, and I'm going to work it myself. I'm not working in this gang labor system that used to be in the past. So they're going to have control over their work. They're going to have control over their family environment, and decide when and how their family and they themselves work. They'll pool their resources and establish churches. Before, when they were slaves, they went to a church controlled by the owner. More than likely a Methodist, maybe an Anglican, and you got a sermon from a white pastor. And he said what? What did he usually focus on? Probably the passage where it says, slaves, obey your masters. And so now they can form their own churches. And these become sort of the political organization, but also the social and community organizations for African Americans in the South. And out of them will spring the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So Ebenezer Baptist, Martin Luther King Sr.'s church in Atlanta, and all the way up through today, just yesterday, through Martin Luther King Day, will be sort of the center for the civil rights movement in the South. They'll also be educated. So going to the Freedmen's Bureau School, 150,000 students will be taught. Traditional black colleges will be formed. Alcorn State, Hampton, Fisk, Morehouse in Atlanta will be established. So these places will train and educate that future middle class that will become the civil rights movement, will become Martin Luther King Jr. So family, churches, schools, Great innovations. What about economically? Economic changes for freed slaves. You ever heard the saying, meet the new boss, same as the old boss? You guys ever gotten a new boss and thought things were going to change and get better, and all of a sudden it's the same job and the same kind of routine? Yeah. So most former slaves have done what their whole life? Worked agriculture, right? Now that the war's over, do they have any more skills that they can use? So what are they going to probably return to? Agriculture. So you're going to have to set a system up where you can use their labor. Because does the North need Southern cotton? Yes. Northern industry, is textile industries in the North, are using Southern cotton for production. So without it, that's going to cause hardship for Northern industries. So you need African Americans to return to agricultural production after the war. There's no economic system in place to transition them. And so, remember that group of people that was following General Sherman after Field Order 15 on that land? Freedmen's Bureau has to come in and say, plantation owner's back, it's his land. I'm sorry, you got to get off. And they evicted him. And they threw him off that land. And so, what sort of system do you set up? They've already said they're not going to work for wages in gangs. So, since most freed slaves said, nope, too much like slavery, the system that emerges is called sharecropping. Sharecropping is basically where it's your land, you're going to loan me the supplies, the seed, and the equipment I need, and then at harvest time, I'm going to give you part of what I produce on this land. Most times around a third to a half of the crop. So say you put in 40 acres, you get to keep 20, and you give 20 back to the landowner. Sound like a good deal? How many of you guys have a credit card? How many of you are in trouble on that credit card? No, don't raise your hands. It's easy to get behind. Okay, I'm starting $2,000 in the hole. And then hopefully in harvest time, come September, I'll make $3,000. I'll be up $1,000, right? Well, you got to live between now and then, right? So what happens? You have to go maybe borrow some more money. You have to maybe charge against the landowner. Maybe he set up a store. You can charge at that store. You start charging more on it. And then by the time you get to harvest, the crop comes in, and you pay off the landowner, and guess how much you have? You got nothing. So then the next year, what are you going to do? You're going to borrow more and start the whole process over. So, although not political slaves, in many ways, they become debt slaves in the South through this system of sharecropping. Because there's no way out of it. What do you say? You know, I owe him like $500. I'm not going to pay. I'm going to run away. What can they do? Well, then they'll put out a warrant for your arrest and bring you back. And then you can go to prison. And so, sharecropping becomes a way to control the black population of the South. What's the only way out of the sharecropping system? You have to move to the North. So starting in the 1920s, through the 1930s, the 40s, many African Americans in the South say, I'm done. And they move north and they get jobs in northern industry. They're not helped by the price of cotton. So cotton, at first at 43 cents a pound, will fall to 11 cents per pound. And so you put your crop in at the beginning of the season thinking you were going to get 20 cents, and by the end you get 11 cents. You guys know any farmers? Easy life. Tough life. Hard work, but then you're so dependent on crop prices. And in today's world, what you can do is you can buy a future, or you can sell it at a prearranged price already. Back then they didn't have that. So If the price dropped right at harvest time, which it always seemed to magically do, you just lost that money. In the north, industrial production continues. All that's covered in your book. We get into it much more deeply in chapter 19. But the main thing to take off this slide is Republicans and corruption. So this Credit Mobilier had owned stock in a railroad company, and they gave stock away to congressmen and cabinet members so that they could get more land to build railroads on at government subsidy. And the whole thing will become sort of blow up and become public knowledge. Some of them will be indicted. And this becomes a big scandal. And Republicans become linked with corruption to the north. And so many in the north and the south will start to distrust the Republicans in the 1870s because of this connection with corruption and the Credit Mobilier scandal. And so finally we get to the end of Reconstruction. The two big markers for the end of Reconstruction are the Depression of 1873 and the election of 1876 of Rutherford B. Hayes. The Depression of 1873 is probably the worst depression in American history. When you think of horrible depressions in American history, you usually think of the Great Depression. This one is often called the Long Depression. It lasts almost 6 years of economic contraction. We just went through a recession that lasted, I think, 2 months or 3 months. If you can imagine 5.5 years of what we went through in 08 and 09. And so businesses closed, 100 banks closed. Back then, if a bank closed and you had money in it, did you get your money back? No, they just sort of smiled at you and said, oh, you should have picked a better bank. Good luck. And so many people in the north are unemployed. They're hungry. And they're not real worried about freed slaves in the South anymore politically. So when we get to the election of 1876, Grant didn't really do anything to solve the Depression. You get Samuel J. Tilden of New York versus Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. And you have this classic matchup between the Civil War vet, Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Northern Democrat. Why not run someone from the South? Can he win? Run a Southern Democrat? No. So you run the Northern Democrat to get the Northern Democratic vote because you know the Southern Democratic vote will vote with you. And here's the map. How many of you can remember the election of 2000, 12 years ago? Wow, I'm old. Okay, but it was disputed. We didn't know who won. Florida was yes, Florida was no. Okay, we had history with this long before 2000. In its election of 1876, you have Northerners still voting as a party, Republican, but you see these inroads that the Democrats have made. New York with Tilden, Indiana, all the way up along the coast, New Jersey. And these southern states come back as we don't know. And they become important because Samuel Tilden has more popular votes than Rutherford B. Hayes. And in the three southern states, 2 electoral votes come back. One for Rutherford B. Hayes, one for Tilden. How are we going to settle this? If you go to court, what both sides agree to do is set up an electoral commission with 19 members. Okay? And they will decide the disputed votes. And those disputed 3 states will be the key to the election. And on that electoral commission, there are 10 Republicans and 9 Democrats. So guess what the final vote is for Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican? 10-9. And so this commission awards it to Hayes, but behind closed doors, they cut a deal with the South and say, we will set aside money federally for improvements, and also we'll withdraw the last of the Union forces from the North, and we'll basically stop interfering in Southern affairs. So if you think any of our recent elections have been dirty, and some people claim they have been, it has nothing on the election of 1876. This was probably one of the dirtier ones in American history. So this is generally seen as the end of Reconstruction and the marker for when we switch into a new era of American history. Questions? So obviously I didn't cover everything in that chapter. There's lots more examples you can pull out of that. But even off just what we covered, I identified some successes, politically, socially, and some failures. Racism is still a part of everyday life, especially in the South and in the North. Segregation in the North. Sharecropping is much like slavery. Politically, blacks were denied political power using the Jim Crow laws, the literacy test, the poll test. And then finally, politically, the KKK was still active. So do you have any questions on this PowerPoint?